To introduce as the Director of Communications for the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. Brother Shawn Eyer is a writer on Masonic symbolism, history, ritual, and philosophy. He is an editor of the Philalethes Society magazine. Brother Eyer has received wide critical acclaim for his editing of the Iman. Is that right? You got to get that in there. A review of the Masonic Culture and Tradition, Volume 1. Brethren, let's welcome Brother Shawn E. Eyer.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to be here once again at the Midwest Conference on Masonic Education. 65 years ago, this conference began right here in Cedar Rapids. Some of you already know it, but for those who don't, in the 20th century, this part of Iowa was the epicenter of Masonic education in North America. It was in nearby Anamosa, Iowa, that the National Masonic Research Society was located. That organization, led by Joseph Fort Newton, published The Builder magazine, one of the finest Masonic periodicals of all time. Here in Cedar Rapids, the Grand Lodge of Iowa's Masonic Library was in full blossom, not just as a leading library, but as a true center of learning about the philosophy of Freemasonry. This was before the days when it became common to believe that Freemasonry was just a charity with a few moral lessons, a time when it was still commonly believed that one ought to plumb the depths of the craft to understand it. One of my favorite quotes is from the chairman of the Iowa Masonic Library, Joseph Morcom. It is not he who has a parrot-like perfection in ritual as his sole qualification, but rather the one who, so far as time and means and talent will allow, devotes study to the deeper esotery of the fraternity. This region became a home for many people who lived by the quest for Masonic knowledge that Brother Morcom calls for. Joseph Fort Newton, Charles Clyde Hunt, and Harry L. Haywood. All of these men believed that Freemasonry was profound, layered and complex meanings of not just a moral, but intellectual, philosophical, and spiritual nature. These writers wrote the books that largely defined Masonic civilization in the 20th century. Something else took place in Cedar Rapids as well. Most of you know that for the last 4 years, in addition to my other Masonic duties, I've been the editor of the Philalethes Journal. The Philalethes Society was created on October 1st, 1928, when a small group of Masonic writers from around the country gathered at the old Masonic Library here in Cedar Rapids. They were some of the most renowned Freemasons of their day: Robert Clegg, George Embry, Cyrus Field Willard, Alfred Morehouse, Henry F. Evans, and William C. Rapp. They gave birth to the Philalethes Society because they recognized that all Freemasons are charged to spread Masonic light, but sometimes that light can be hard to find. They labored together and created an organization that would go on to become the strongest independent Masonic research organization in the world. So here we are at the epicenter. We have a rich legacy to maintain, and by coming here today, all of you have affirmed your commitment to the long-term importance of Masonic education. Or, wait a sec. Masonic education. It's a fascinating phrase. You know, I researched this a few years ago, and I couldn't find any reference to it older than an 1831 anti-Masonic speech given in Boston. but it doesn't refer to what we would call Masonic education. Used in the way that we apply it here at this conference, Masonic education is a late 19th century term. Now, does this mean that in 1850, 1800, 1750, or earlier, there was no such thing as Masonic education? Many of you who participated in last year's conference in Winnipeg will recall that I made the argument there that the early Masons had no special term for Masonic education because to them, providing light and instruction was an essential part of the lodge. By way of illustration, I'm going to recap some of the interesting early language of the brethren at that time. We think of the 18th century as a kind of golden age for the craft because in the early 1700s, the various traditions that Masons had created and ceremony had created and preserved coalesced into an identifiable series of degrees and ceremonies that we observe even now. Our 3 degrees, the installation ceremony, our consecration ritual. By 1730, all of these things are in place. They were still in flux, but most of the ideas in them were there. Now, if anyone knew what Freemasonry was about, I wondered, perhaps it would be these Masons of the 1720s and 30s. Early in my Masonic work, I found it odd that we have such a strange relationship with the early Masonic evidence. Even those few who do study these things tend to say pretty disparaging things about the early Masons, and almost none are willing to see Freemasonry as our founders saw it. At first, I joined in the culture of bemusement until I realized these are our founders, the very men who gave us our beloved Masonic tradition, the very men who scholars tell us developed the trigradal system of Freemasonry. Maybe they shouldn't be dismissed with a chuckle. Among the other things of interest that I noticed in their writings was that the early Masons never spoke of Masonic education. The term did not exist in their vocabulary. And that's not as some would suggest, because the first speculative lodges were just places where brethren ate, sang, and drank in simple fellowship and nothing more. That picture of early Masonry was promoted heavily in the 20th century. For example, one modern scholar has written that before 1760 or so, Freemasonry contained nothing for the mind. Now, that may have reflected the reality in some early lodges, but those lodges were not considered proper or acceptable, and they were openly and vigorously criticized for becoming places where men simply dined and were entertained. So if there was no Masonic education as such, what was the counterpoint to this? In the Masonic regulations of the Old Lodge at York, dated 1725, we find Article 13. It says something very interesting. This is the whole regulation. There's not more to it. This is number 13. An hour shall be set apart to talk Masonry. Not just to talk socially, but to talk about Freemasonry, to explore the Masonic tradition itself. It was a regulation that an hour of each meeting be devoted to learning about the craft. An oration by Brother Francis Drake from December 27th, 1726 tells us more. Drake was a York Mason, and he says, "I am credibly informed that in most lodges in London and several other parts of this kingdom, a lecture on some point of geometry or architecture is given at every meeting." What did the London Masons say about this? Well, one of them, Edward Oakley, who moved to London from Wales and was a past provincial senior grand warden in Carmarthen, made an address at a lodge in London on December 31, 1728. In this talk, he refers to the craft as this most ingenious and sublime science of Masonry, and as a sacred mystery. Brother Oakley is very concerned about the wrong kind of people coming into Freemasonry, people who, quote, make their belly their God. I love that quote. I've never met anyone like that, but yeah. Now, who does he want to see instead? Let's take a look. He says their qualifications to be, by studying architecture, working in the craft or building trades, ingenious sculptors, painters, or well-skilled in arithmetic or geometry, otherwise qualified by real merits, such as may redound to the encouragement, promotion, and honor of sound Masonry. Well, that's easy for Oakley to say. He was an architect by trade. But would he let people without building experience into the lodge? Yes. Those of the brotherhood, he says, whose genius is not adapted to building, I hope will be industrious to improve in, or at least to love and encourage some part of the 7 liberal sciences, which in some sort depend on each other. Music, harmony, and proportion run through all. In other words, he regards it as an essential characteristic of a Mason that he's fascinated by subjects that improve the mind. How is this expressed in a lodge? Oakley continues. It is highly necessary for the improvement of the members of a lodge that such instruments and books be provided as be convenient and useful in the exercise and for the advancement of this divine science of Masonry, and that proper lectures be constantly read in such of the sciences as shall be thought to be most agreeable to the society and to the honor and instruction of the craft. This is why I say that what we call Masonic education, they just called Freemasonry. The subject matter of these early lodges included all of the liberal arts and sciences, plus architecture as a sort of union of everything as a divine science. What could a divine science be? When we think of science, we think of people in lab coats with sophisticated equipment around them. But in those days, the word science referred to any kind of knowledge that requires systematic study to absorb. Similarly, when we hear the word art, we think of painting, sculpture, and so on. But in those days, the word art referred to any field in which creativity, skill, and aesthetics were called for. Both science and art refer to undertakings that require a highly active and developed mind. I won't dwell on this for too long, but it won't do to leave out that sometimes the instructions of early lodges included what today we would call esotericism. For example, here's a section of a Masonic book from 1736. This text describes the building of the Temple of Solomon in mystical terms and ties that to the symbolism of the lodge and the master's educational role in a mysterious way. It says, "What glory must have redounded to the Masons concerned in this work, under the immediate care and direction of heaven, who had built a house for the Most High, whom the heaven of heavens cannot contain to reside in, nor were those Masons excluded a place in this wondrous house, who had so well traced out the designs of the Almighty Architect, and still kept in pursuit of the central glory of the lodge, where the 2 seals conceal one another. To this center Moses paved the way, and from hence the path is open to excellence, but he must be a master, and well warded too that can teach it, and he well prepared that can receive it. Let the candidate for Masonry be a lover of art." Do you know what he means by all that? Me either. Because the kind of esoteric knowledge that he was talking about, unfortunately, did not get passed down to us. They called it speculative Masonry. Their lodges explored topics from myth to science, the classical liberal arts to architecture, mysticism to biology. These things were not part of a Masonic education program. They were the business of the lodge. This was Freemasonry. Those brethren knew that profound truths often required careful consideration and deep contemplation, and they tried to make their lodges into real temples of learning. As one of them said around 1731, pardon me. As one of them said around 1731, "Sublime truths are not obtained any otherwise than by a right study and an endeavor to find out the real sense, which being always veiled, are holy therefore and sacred." Lodges that became too filled with brethren who did not value this quest for light were harshly criticized in early Masonic writings. The 1728 text, I've quoted a few times, refers to such people as false brethren who fail in their duty and obedience by their ignorance and being strangers to the intent and constitution of the science. They think they are sufficiently qualified if they make themselves known to be Masons and are good companions to sing merry songs or create mirth by some idle, loose diversion. These early Freemasons had a clear picture of what they expected a brother to be like. He should have skill in something constructive or edifying and a keen mind to learn and improve himself. He must not be a frivolous person seeking entertainment, dinner parties, wine and song, or business connections. The craft knew what it was then. These are the Masons who gave us our traditions, formed our trigradal system, and wrote the first books of constitutions. Reflecting on what these early lodge meetings must have been like, by now you might have guessed why my title is the oldest term for Masonic education. Just Freemasonry, or speculative Freemasonry, Masonic light, good and wholesome instruction. Similarly, listen to the definition of a lodge from William Preston's original lectures. You'll remember that Preston was the greatest editor of the Masonic lecture tradition, and that most of our lodges are doing something called the Preston Webb work. So, he probably knows what he's talking about. What is a lodge of Masons, he asks. And the answer in the original 1772 lecture is, any number of Masons assembled for the express purpose of explaining Masonry. So it wasn't just the 1720s, it wasn't just the 1730s, all the way up until the classical period when the rituals that we still do are being done. The people creating those rituals are still defining Masonry are still defining a lodge as a place where Masonry is explained. That's why they didn't have a word for Masonic education. It was out of the formal conversation and prepared orations of the early lodges that our traditional lectures evolved. They are an artifact of that organic process, a great gleaning from decades of Masonic discussion. And although the lectures have rightly been adopted as part of our static tradition today, it was certainly never intended for conversation about Masonry to cease. This is why so many lodges are bringing back the traditional approach. I've enjoyed being part of one of the early traditional observance lodges where, just like the early brethren, we never refer to Masonic education as such. We do set aside an hour or more to talk about Masonry when we meet. Sometimes people think that traditional observance is in the trappings, but the real soul of it, when it's done right, is the restoration of conversation and exploration of the meaning of Masonry. This creates an initiatic atmosphere in which Masonic education is not a program, it's just the lifeblood of the lodge. But whether we're setting aside an hour to explore the mysteries of Freemasonry or a shorter amount of time, we now know that we are advised by the early Masons that the examination and explanation of Freemasonry was a normal function of a healthy lodge. In fact, it was part of the duties of the master to diffuse that light and instruction. The original lodge education officer was the master. This is our history and our tradition. The extent to which we can restore it will vary, but it's pleasant work, at least I've found it to be. This is really a pep talk, brethren. I don't recommend that you literally attempt to use the arguments that I've laid out here to justify the expansion of Masonic education in your lodges. Talking about 1735 and 1722 and all of this would seem pedantic. But knowing that there is such a strong traditional support for the role of education in the life of the lodge will give you greater confidence in promoting your best Masonic education efforts. We are justified in doing this, and knowing that lends authority to our labors. Yesterday evening, the Grand Master of Iowa said something fascinating to us at the opening ceremony. He said, there are no new ideas. We just take old ideas and reuse them. Because that's exactly the philosophy that I take toward Masonic education. We don't have to invent anything. Recipes for good, effective, and engaging Masonic education were already known to our brethren centuries ago. So restoration, not necessarily reinvention, is needed. And it's not really that hard to do. Which brings me to a little pitch about the Philalethes Society. When it was founded, the goal of the society was to provide educational materials and spread Masonic light. That's still the goal of the society, and we pursue it in three ways today. First, our quarterly magazine, which presents a variety of articles ranging from light academic research to interpretive pieces. It's accessible material, all of which is suitable for sharing in your lodge, orally or by giving out Xerox copies. Next is our new free e-bulletin, which you can subscribe to online. It's a digital mini magazine. And finally, we have an established series of articles in electronic form for lodges and grand lodges, issued quarterly. You can subscribe to this and receive material appropriate for reprinting in your lodge or grand lodge publications or websites. We have a table set up here at the Library and Museum and also at the Scottish Rite Temple. So if you're not a member or used to be a member and want to see the improvements we've been making, stop by and see us, please. We have free samples of the journal, so please pick one up. We'd love to have you as a member. Every day, thousands of people drive past the Masonic Library and Museum here in Cedar Rapids, where in beautiful carved marble we find a quotation by Iowa's Joseph Fort Newton that defines the mission of Freemasonry in terms far more eloquent than our thinkers of late have managed to frame. It says, "Gentle, gracious, and wise, its mission is to form mankind into a great redemptive brotherhood, a league of noble and free men enlisted in the radiant enterprise of working out in time the love and will of the eternal." Now, brethren, if we approach our Masonic education efforts in the spirit that Newton describes, we will fulfill the unparalleled legacy that Cedar Rapids represents in the culture of North American Freemasonry. And if we include the discussion of Masonic learning in our lodges, like our brethren of the early and classical Grand Lodge eras recommended, we will meet the expectations, the needs of all those brethren who seek our light. Thank you very much.